many firms, whether they say it explicitly or implicitly, will articulate the idea that shareholder value, driving shareholder value, is a fundamental goal of the firm. Some are more explicit. Some simply say our primary mission is to drive shareholder value. Some are less explicit and say our primary mission is to focus on our customers and our employees, and incidentally from the benefits that that creates to drive shareholder value. But either way, shareholder value remains an embedded principle in terms of defining core corporate governance. It is simply the reality, whether stated outright or whether implicit, that defines the behavior of many firms. This begs the question, I think it begs two questions. The first is, what is the purpose of the firm? And the second is, who are these shareholders? And I think both deserve our attention in the context of this discussion. The reason I asked the first one, what is the purpose of the firm, is because when I ask what the purpose of the firm is, I'm actually asking another question implicitly, which is, who owns the firm? Remember that Milton Friedman back in 1970 said the management of a firm works for the owners, and that their job is to generate as much profit as possible for the owners. So who is the owner of the firm? That's a critical question in the context of this idea. Well, the owner of the firm is the firm itself. The shareholder does not own the firm. That's the price of limited liability. If you want limited liability when you buy a share in a firm, the payoff is you don't actually own the firm. You're not taking a piece of ownership. You don't have any legal ownership rights over the firm. The only rights you have are those that are specified in the contractual relationship between the firm as its own self-constituting entity and you as a shareholder. You may get a voting right, for example, under that contractual relationship, but you may not. It's not clear. The point being that the idea that the shareholder is the owner of the firm has no basis whatsoever in law. You as a shareholder don't sign contracts with suppliers. You as a shareholder don't expect somebody to come to your door when the radio that they bought from the firm that you bought in isn't working. You're not responsible for the quality of their products. You're not responsible for their mistakes. You are simply making a bet as to their future performance via a share, which is a proxy ownership. But it's not actual ownership, which means that there is no moral obligation on the part of the firm to you as an owner, because you don't actually have that position. The obligation of the firm is to itself. And if that's the case, what then is the purpose of the firm? I think a lot of us would answer sort of instinctively, the purpose of the firm is to make profit. Because if a firm doesn't make profit, it's not a firm for very long. I don't like that answer. I don't think that answer is sufficient. I'm going to suggest a slight modification of that statement. The purpose of the firm is to secure its profitability. I think that is a better way of thinking about the firm. You can make a profit and not necessarily secure your own profitability. And if you're doing that, you're not necessarily acting in the interests of the firm itself. From the context of the firm as an abstraction, as a legally constituted individual entity, its function, its purpose is to secure its own profitability going forward so that it may continue to exist. So when a shareholder buys a share of a firm, they're essentially buying an organization which, under the proper, I think we could argue, under an ideal management framework, is seeking to secure its own profitability now, tomorrow, 10 years from now, into the future indefinitely. Is that, in fact, what shareholders are doing? Well, let's look at that question. And we should start by asking, who is the shareholder? We read about it all the time. It's in the media. It's on the radio. We hear the shareholder value, the shareholders were angry, the shareholders were happy. Who is the shareholder? That's a question I don't think we ask ourselves enough. It sounds like a nice abstract term, the shareholder. But let's flesh out who is the shareholder before we consider then the nature of shareholding. Who owns the vast majority of shares today? And the answer to that question is the top 10% of society. The top 10% of society controls about 90% of all shares, mutual funds, pensions, all of that stuff put together. 90% of that is in the hands of the top 10%. And within that, about 46%, my numbers come from Ed Wolf, the NYU professor who does a lot of work on the nature of wealth distribution. And these numbers are from the United States, but I would argue they apply to other countries as well. Within that top 10% who controls 90% of all the shares that are out there, the top 1% controls almost half, 46%. So when we think of the shareholder, the first person we should think of is the top 1%. They own by far and away the largest plurality of all shares. And then after them, the next 9%. The bottom 90% essentially are excluded from that category. So when we think of the shareholder, we should be thinking of this very small top group. Now, it's important to note that under the shareholder value paradigm, the nature of shareholding hasn't changed. If you look at the ownership of all shares, pension funds, mutual funds, etc., in the market today, and you go back to 1983, it's about the same. It was controlled by 90% controlled by 10% back in 1983, 90% controlled by 10% today. So shareholder value as a corporate governance principle has not further concentrated the nature of shareholder ownership. And yet, over that period of time, what have we seen? In country after country, what we see is extremely accelerating wealth inequality to the point where now we have very extreme, historically exceptional levels of wealth distribution in our societies, which means that the people who have historically dominated that shareholder class are getting more value for their ownership, quote unquote, for their position. In other words, over the period of time, firms have become more effective at driving value into the hands of that small class of people. So let's just remember that that's who we're talking about when we talk about the shareholder. We're not saying it in a positive way. We're not saying it in a negative way. It's just a fact. The sun comes up tomorrow. 90% of shares are held by the top 10%. It's not a matter of opinion. It's not a matter of debate. We don't get to say, I believe. It's simply reality. That's what it is. So when we talk about the shareholder and shareholder value, we're talking about a small elite in society, the top 10%, and within that, preponderantly, the top 1%. When we move up to other forms of financial and securities instruments, the preponderance of concentration becomes even higher. So when we look at sort of more complicated instruments, like derivatives and so on, the ownership concentrates even further. I believe 63% of these more sophisticated securities instruments are controlled by the top 1% of the population. So all that to say, shareholding is concentrated in the hands of a very few people. That is the shareholder. Let's ask then about the nature of shareholding since the 1970s, the people who have benefited from the emergence of the shareholder value paradigm. In this, I think it's a fairly straightforward argument. I think one of the nice things about this is there's a lot of clarity that we can bring to this question. If you send your money to a money manager, that is to say a mutual fund or a pension fund, any institution that's investing on your behalf, you do so through a contractual relationship which also implicates a kind of moral obligation on the part of the person who's taking your money. And that moral obligation, that contractual obligation, is pretty straightforward. If you give them your money, you expect them to create optimal returns for you. That's why you send them your money in the first place, right? In other words, an institution that is engaged in investing on your behalf, its first and foremost, indeed really its only obligation, is to who? To its own shareholders, to the people who gave them the money. That's what you would expect. You would not give money to somebody who was going to invest it on your behalf who didn't think that. That would be an incompetent money manager, somebody who did not understand her job. And I think it's this insight, it's a pretty basic insight, but I think it's that insight that creates some of the problems that we find in the context of shareholder value theory. If an institution is primarily driven by its unambiguous moral obligation to its own shareholders, it means that on any given day it needs to review its positions and decide, based on the information at hand, how to generate optimal results for those people. And if it's not doing that, if the money manager is not doing that, they're not doing their job. Not to say that money managers don't have their own agency issues, but that's a fundamental obligation. We would all agree, I think, that that's an unambiguous duty on the part of anybody who's managing somebody else's money. Which means, as soon as an institutional investor representing other stakeholders, representing other investors, can identify an opportunity which might generate a better return than the one that they're in at the moment, do they not have a moral obligation to their own shareholders to clear out the first position and take the second? Do they not have a moral obligation, in other words, to do whatever they need to do in order to generate the optimal returns that their own investors reasonably expect them to generate? And if they're not doing that, should they be managing your money in the first place? And surely the answer to that is no. Is that compatible? Is that attitude of an investor compatible with the long-term interests of a firm? The purpose of a firm is to secure its profitability, which means to think about what it needs to do so that today, tomorrow, 5 years, and 10 years, it remains a profitable organization. Is that desire on the part of the firm consistent with the kind of interests that institutional investors bring to the table? I'm going to argue that it is not, because the problem with institutional investing is it locks in clear and unambiguous moral terms a short-term perspective. The long-term relationship on the part of an institutional investor is with its own shareholders, be they firemen or teachers who have their pension money in it, be it very wealthy men who are using it sort of a hedge fund offshore, be it whatever organization it is. Doesn't really matter. The obligation is clear. And that means, from the institutional investment perspective, there really can be no such thing as a long-term investment, because that's incompatible with the fundamental mandate of the institution itself. Because it suggests that you're locking yourself into a relationship which may, as a result of management decisions outside of your control, lead to suboptimal returns for your own investors. And that is not consistent with the mandate of a money manager, not consistent with the mandate of an institutional investor. Which means that a long-term relationship that's established between an institution and a firm, it's a definition that comes to me by way of a student a number of years ago who was involved in this business. He put it very well. I've stolen it from him and used it ever since. Is simply a series of short-term investments that you choose to renew. And that does something very interesting to the firm in terms of how the firm then perceives itself. Because it means that for the firm, the most important thing then, if that's the kind of relationship they have with their own investors, is to meet the expectations that those investors have in order for that relationship to be renewed. And so what we find over the last, say, 15, 20 years is that increasingly firms have moved into what we might call the market of expectations. Manage your earnings, show the street what it needs to see, smooth things out, get that investment renewed. That's critical. We know this is the case because there was an article published in 2005 called The Economic Implications of Corporate Financial Reporting. When you see a title like that, you just have to read it, right? I mean, that's just literally bedtime reading. They went and surveyed 400 or so of the leading CFOs, so of the top corporations. They surveyed some 400 CFOs, and they sent them various series of questionnaires and so on. And what they found was that the CFO saw his, less frequently her, job primarily to match or meet the expectations of the market, even if that meant sacrificing future value. In other words, matching short-term expectations was more important, more fundamental to their job than creating long-term value. And they knew this because they gave them a scenario in which they could disappoint short-term expectations but drive long-term enterprise value, and a shockingly large number of them chose not to make that investment because of the harm they felt that would come to their company by disappointing the street the next quarter. In a sense, that shouldn't surprise us. If we're in a market where the nature of investment is by moral obligation and by contractual definition short-term, it is not surprising then that the firm should end up responding to that incentive and embracing a short-term perspective, trying to manage its earnings, trying to meet those short-term expectations, and thereby foregoing the possibility of generating long-term enterprise value. In other words, short-termism becomes the logic then that informs the firm.